The term metaphysical poets was coined by the critic Samuel Johnson to describe a loose group of 17th-century English poets whose work was characterized by the inventive use of conceits, and by a greater emphasis on the spoken rather than lyrical quality of the verse. These poets were not formally affiliated and few were highly regarded until 20th-century attention established their importance. Given the lack of coherence as a movement, and the diversity of style between poets, it has been suggested that calling them Baroque poets after their era might be more useful. Origin of the name. In the chapter on Abraham Cowley in his Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets, Samuel Johnson refers to the beginning of the 17th century in which there appeared a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets. This does not necessarily imply that he intended metaphysical to be used in its true sense, in that he was probably referring to a witticism of John Dryden, who said of John Donne, "He affects the metaphysics, not only in his satires, but in his amorous verses, where nature only should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage the hearts, and entertain them with the softnesses of love." In this, Mr. Cowley has copied him to a fault. Probably the only writer before Dryden to speak of a certain metaphysical school or group of metaphysical poets is Drummond of Hawthornden, who in one of his letters speaks of metaphysical ideas and scholastical quiddities. Nor was Johnson's assessment of metaphysical poetry at all flattering. The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was the whole endeavor, but, unluckily resolving to show it in rhyme, instead of writing poetry, they only wrote verses, and, very often, such verses as stood the trial of the finger better than of the ear, for the modulation was so imperfect, that they were only found to be verses by counting the syllables. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. Their learning instructs, and the subtlety surprises, but the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and, though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. When it came to justify his charges with examples, Johnson quoted just 3 poets, Cowley himself, John Donne and John Cleveland, which is hardly sufficient for such a blanket condemnation. Instead, he was repeating the disapproval of earlier critics who upheld the rival canons of Augustan poetry. For though Johnson may have given the metaphysical school the name by which it is now known, he was far from being the first to condemn 17th-century poetic usage of conceit and wordplay. John Dryden had already satirized the Baroque taste for them in his Mac Flecknoe, and Joseph Addison, in quoting him, singled out the poetry of George Herbert as providing a flagrant example. 20th-century recognition. There is no scholarly consensus regarding which English poets or poems fit within the metaphysical genre. Colin Burrow, writing for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, singles out John Donne, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, and Richard Crashaw as central figures, while naming many more, all a part of whose work has been identified as sharing its characteristics. 20th-century anthologies have been important in defining the metaphysical canon. Herbert Grierson's Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century and Helen Gardner's Metaphysical Poets. The latter also included proto-metaphysical poets such as William Shakespeare and Sir Walter Raleigh, and, extending into the Restoration, brought in Edmund Waller and the Earl of Rochester. While comprehensive, her selection, as Burrow remarks, remarks, so dilutes the style as to make it virtually coextensive with 17th-century poetry. During the course of the 1920s, T.S. Eliot did much to establish the importance of the school, both through his critical writing and by applying the method in his own work. By 1961, A. Alvarez was commenting that it may perhaps be a little late in the day to be writing about the metaphysicals. The great vogue for Donne passed with the passing of the Anglo-American experimental movement in modern poetry. Quote, 2 decades later, a hostile view was expressed that emphasis on their importance had been an attempt by Eliot and his followers to impose a high Anglican and royalist literary history on 17th-century English poetry. Burroughs' opinion, on the other hand, is that the term metaphysical poet still retains some value. For one thing, Donne's poetry had considerable influence on subsequent poets who emulated his style, and there are several instances in which 17th-century poets used the word metaphysical in the work, meaning that Samuel Johnson's description has some foundation in the usage of the previous century. However, the term does isolate English poets from those who shared similar stylistic traits in Europe and America. Since the 1960s, therefore, it has been argued that gathering all of these under the heading of Baroque poets would be more helpfully inclusive. A sense of community. Johnson's definition of the metaphysical poets was that of a hostile critic looking back at the style of the previous century. In 1958, Alvarez proposed an alternative approach in a series of lectures eventually published as The School of Donne. This was to look at the practice and self-definition of the circle of friends about Donne, who were the recipients of many of his verse letters. They were a group of some 15 young professionals with an interest in poetry, many of them poets themselves, although, like Donne for much of his life, few of them published the work. Instead, copies were circulated in manuscript among them. Uncertain ascriptions resulted in some poems from the fraternity being ascribed to Donne by later editors. A younger second generation was a close-knit group of courtiers, some of them with family or professional ties to Donne's circle, who were initially borrowed Donne's manner to cultivate wit. Among them were Lord Herbert of Cherbury and his brother George, whose mother Magdalen was another recipient of verse letters by Donne. Eventually George Herbert, Henry Vaughan and Richard Crashaw, all of whom knew each other, took up the religious life and extended the formerly secular approach into this new area. A later generation of metaphysical poets, writing during the Commonwealth, became increasingly more formulaic and lacking in vitality. These included Cleveland and his imitators, as well as such transitional figures as Cowley and Marvell. What all had in common, according to Alvarez, was esteem, not for metaphysics but for intelligence. Johnson's remark that, to write on the plan it was at least necessary to read and think, only echoed its recognition a century and a half before, in the many tributes paid to Donne on his death. For example, Jasper Main's comment that for the fellow readers of his work, we are thought wits when 'tis understood, coupled with it went a vigorous sense of the speaking voice. It begins with the rough versification of the satires written by Donne and others in his circle such as Everard Gilpin and John Rowe. Later it modulates into the thoughtful religious poems of the next generation with their exclamatory or conversational openings and the sense of the mind playing over the subject and examining it from all sides. Helen Gardner too had noted the dramatic quality of this poetry as a personal address of argument and persuasion, whether talking to a physical lover, to God, to Christ's Mother Mary, or to a congregation of believers. A different approach to defining the community of readers is to survey who speaks of whom and in what manner in the poetry. On the death of Donne, it is natural that his friend Edward Herbert should write him an elegy full of high-flown and exaggerated metaphysical logic. In a similar way, Abraham Cowley marks the deaths of Crashaw and of another member of Donne's literary circle, Henry Wotton. Here, however, though Cowley acknowledges Crashaw briefly as a writer, his governing focus is on how Crashaw's goodness transcended his change of religion. The elegy is as much an exercise in a special application of logic as was Edward Herbert's on Donne. Henry Wotton, on the other hand, is not remembered as a writer at all, but instead for his public career. The conjunction of his learning and role as ambassador becomes the extended metaphor on which the poem's tribute turns. 12 elegies upon the author accompanied the posthumous first collected edition of Donne's work, Poems by J.D., with elegies of the author's death, and were reprinted in subsequent editions over the course of the next 2 centuries. Though the poems were often cast in a suitably metaphysical style, half were written by fellow clergymen, few of whom are remembered for their poetry. Among those who was Henry King. Richard Corbett was also a very minor poetic adherent. Other churchmen included Henry Valentine, Edward Hyde, Richard Busby, and Jasper Mayne, then known as an author but soon to take clerical orders. 2 poets, Lucius Carey, 2nd Viscount Falkland, and Thomas Carew, who were joined in the 1635 edition by Sidney Godolphin, had links with the heterodox Great Jew Circle. They also served as courtiers, as did Endymion Porter, and Carew had been in the service of Edward Herbert. Isaac Walton's link with Donne's circle was more tangential. He had friends within the Great Jew Circle, but at the time of his elegy was working as a researcher for Henry Wotton, who intended writing a life of the poet. This project Walton inherited after Wotton's death, publishing it under his own name in 1640. It was followed by a life of Wotton himself and prefaced the collection of his works in 1651. A life of George Herbert followed them in 1670. The links between Donne's elegists were thus of a different order from those between Donne and his circle of friends, often no more than professional acquaintanceship, and once the poetic style had been launched, its tone and approach remained available as a model for later writers who might not necessarily commit themselves so wholly to its characteristics. The style was characterized by wit and metaphysical conceits, far-fetched or unusual similes or metaphors, such as in Andrew Marvell's comparison of the soul with a drop of dew, or Donne's description of the effects of absence on lovers to the action of a pair of compasses. The specific definition of wit which Johnson applied to the school was, a kind of discordia concos, a combination of dissimilar images, or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. The poetry diverged from the style of the times, being less dependent on conventional images of nature or allusions to classical mythology. Several metaphysical poets, especially John Donne, were influenced by Neoplatonism. One of the primary Platonic concepts found in metaphysical poetry is the idea that the perfection of beauty in the beloved acted as a remembrance of perfect beauty in the eternal realm. The work relies on images and references to the contemporary scientific and geographical discoveries. These were used to examine religious and moral questions, often employing an element of casuistry. Bibliography. A. Alvarez, The School of Donne, London 1961. Elegies upon the author, in Poems by J.D., with elegies of the author's death, London 1633. Gardner, Helen. The Metaphysical Poets. Grierson, Sir Herbert J. C. Metaphysical Lyrics and Amp. Poems of the 17th Century, Oxford, 1921. Johnson, Samuel. The Life of Cowley, extracted from A Lives of the Poets.